Some of you may know that my background was in the trade union movement. Most of my working life was spent in the TUC, but today I'm chair of Acas, as well as being deputy chair of the Banking Standards Board. Acas is, of course, a very different organisation from the TUC, although the two are sometimes confused, perhaps, in the minds of some. When Acas is mentioned, most people think of major industrial disputes, and conciliating a collective disputes is a hugely important responsibility for Acas. But it's actually only a small part of what we do to try and help improve employment relations in Britain and raise organisational efficiency and productivity. We're also involved in dealing with individual employment disputes. Last year, about 90,000 people with employment tribunal cases brought their issues to Acas to see if our conciliation could resolve the issue with their employer without the need for all the expense and the stress of a tribunal hearing. We answer employment queries and provide advice and guidance on every aspect of employment in organisations of every shape and size and in every sector of the economy. Last year, our telephone helpline took about 1 million calls, with millions more visiting our website. We also provide in-depth support and offer training to around 30,000 people last year on a wide range of issues, including workplace relationships and well-being, which brings me really to today's subject. Now, the title for my session perhaps sounds a little bit daunting, but it's really all about how you can work with your staff to get the best out of them and to help them lead satisfying and healthy working lives. We know from extensive research that looking after the emotional and mental health of employees has a number of really positive advantages. It can increase productivity through delivering greater individual job satisfaction and motivation. It can help develop better relationships, which in turn produces working environments where innovation thrives and conflict is handled effectively. And last but perhaps not least, I think it's actually the right thing to do. Work has always been based on a system of give and take, and well-being is now very much part of this reciprocal relationship. So we know what the advantages are, but how do we go about realizing these? And this afternoon I want to look at perhaps some answers to this question, with particular reference to this concept of a psychological contract. But before coming on to that, just a couple of thoughts about the background to our current circumstances. I think we're in a period where many people would say there's a sense of increasing stress for many people across all sorts of workplaces. Our economy has seen two very big shocks that have perhaps added to that problem. The financial crisis of 2008 and the recession that it led to, of course, caused huge pressures in businesses of all sorts across our economy. In the financial sector, I think it was estimated that something like 100,000 jobs were lost as a result of that crisis. Now, of course, we've seen the second huge shock of the decision on Brexit, which in turn has led to projections of potentially in the financial sector yet further job losses as institutions look to their location and consider potentially moving significant number of jobs to other parts of Europe. And when job losses happen, of course, that's a real huge problem for those who leave organisations, but it's also a huge problem too for those remainers who are potentially faced with very increased work pressures that they have to deal with. So all of this uncertainty inevitably perhaps has its effect on those who work in the city. Only the other week, reports emerged of a MetLife research report showing some 40% of financial institution decision makers reporting that their job was extremely stressful, and that stress levels amongst investment bankers had led some 2/3 of them to consider quitting their jobs altogether. And these findings are also backed up, just to say, by work done by the Banking Standards Board recently, which has shown that the impact of working in the sector on the health of well-being of staff is emerging as a real issue. So inevitably, this is putting a strain on the psychological contract between employer and employee. So what do we mean by talking about the psychological contract? Well, of course, the normal understanding of the employment contract is that it's based on explicit guarantees in terms of pay and working conditions. It sets out employer and employee responsibilities. The psychological contract, though, is much more to do with expectations about the way people will treat each other at work. We're talking about things like trust and respecting employee voice and celebrating diversity. In Acas's advisory booklet on engaging employees for business success, we describe the psychological contract as an employment exchange. At a very simple level, this idea involves employees providing labour in return for some reward. And in the past, many employers were able to offer employees a sense of real permanent job security, and employees often gave long-term loyalty and commitment in exchange. But today, the employment exchange looks rather different, doesn't it? No one really expects a job for life anymore. The gig economy seems, for many, to be the employment model of the future. And add to that the growing concerns around growth in automation, and future generations may barely recognize the employment relationship that was so familiar to me when I was very much younger. But before we throw the baby out with the bathwater, I would argue that despite the accelerating change, many employers are beginning to realize that long-term workplace effectiveness and job satisfaction can go hand in hand if we develop a greater understanding of the whole person and not just the person that we see at work, if we engage in honest, open dialogues about how to get the best from individuals and the business, and if we recognize that this is an ongoing conversation that we have to keep alive, particularly when faced with the kind of uncertainties that I spoke of earlier. Now, I'm guessing that other speakers today will have covered health and well-being at an organizational level, but I'd like to concentrate on what line managers can do to understand and motivate their employees on the front line. Research from Bath University has shown that line managers have the potential to what they described as triggering positive discretionary behaviour. This is described in some quarters, I think, a little unhelpfully, as going the extra mile. But this extra motivation and pride in your work is often triggered by good one-to-one interactions between staff and their immediate managers. We certainly know that if these relationships are not managed well, they can have a very detrimental impact on well-being. For example, the latest CIPD absence survey showed that some of the main causes of workplace stress and high levels of absenteeism include management style and the lack of support for employees from line managers. So what can managers do? Well, the truth is that the psychological contract we have with each other needs, I think, to be rather more explicit now than it perhaps was in the past. This means that the things that drive the way we behave and the way we feel should no longer be assumed or taken for granted. What we're talking about here is not that complicated. It's advanced common sense, sometimes referred to as emotional intelligence. The academic Rob Briner has described emotional intelligence as the identification of specific emotions in oneself and in others, and using emotion to guide thought and actions. Now, Acas recently published a policy paper based upon some new research from Coventry University, and the paper, called The Road Less Travelled, Taking the Informal Route to Conflict Resolution, looks at how emotional intelligence can improve well-being by focusing on earlier, more informal interventions in potential disputes at work. There are two factors that have a particularly strong influence over the relationship between an employee and their line manager. And the first of these is the level of perceived autonomy that they feel they have. Are they trusted to get on with a job and use their initiative? And if they need help, is it readily available? And secondly, the nature of the relationship they have with their manager. Is this one where an employee feels that he can rely on the manager to be supportive and encouraging, even in difficult circumstances? It's worth perhaps reflecting just a little bit on how important autonomy is when it comes to good work and working relationships. Research has shown that, of course, it's those with least power, the smallest sense of control in the workplace, who actually typically suffer the most stress. Psychologists have long argued that giving employees discretion about how they organize their work can lead not only to better use of skills and tacit knowledge, but also it can lead to more creative approaches to problem solving. A lot has been written about the need to allow staff to be able to fail, to take risks without fear of being blamed if something goes wrong. Now, of course, the financial crisis highlighted the huge dangers of unconstrained risk-taking, and risk management and effective supervision of trading decision-making, for example, rightly receives a very high priority post the crisis. But I think the broad principle is nevertheless true wherever you work, that line managers really need to encourage and enable employees to function with as much autonomy as possible. So what I'm saying is that the psychological contract or the employment exchange is now as much about the relationship between a line manager and a member of staff as it is between an employee and their employer, their place of work, more generally. Let me finish by just saying a few words about conflict at work, which of course can be seen by some as undermining the psychological contract. But of course, in any working relationship, clashes can occur, whether through personality differences or through turf wars, different interests bumping into each other, or indeed major collective disputes erupting. Conflict is an inevitable part of working life, and of course it can have major downsides, but it can also, I would argue, have an upside. Now, some of you may be skeptical about this, but in my experience, conflictual situations can, if handled correctly, lead to some of the most creative solutions for workplaces. Changes that can really change the course of employment relations and enhance opportunities for organizations to grow and to prosper. So I wanted to leave you with just 3 thoughts about conflict at work. And the first is to ask the question, who's responsible for managing conflict in your workplace? Conflict management is often the responsibility of the line manager, but it needs to be recognized, I think, as a strategic issue shared by senior management, HR, and indeed employee representatives too. And if line managers are expected to handle these issues, have they actually been given the training and support that they need to be able to carry those responsibilities out well? The second thought is, do your managers understand the value in conflict situations of early intervention? Early intervention really means taking hold of an issue before it escalates and gets even more difficult to resolve. It means, too, understanding your staff and recognizing the emotions in the situation. So that takes us perhaps back to that thought of emotional intelligence. And thirdly and finally, do you know the difference between good and bad? Because, you know, paradoxically, grievances can be a sign that you've actually got an open culture where people think they will get a fair hearing about problems, that they will be listened to. So don't assume that developing the right kinds of relationships at work will eliminate disagreements, but it may mean that they're handled very, very much better. Protecting and enhancing the psychological contract, I think, is all about sticking to the promises we make to each other, put very simply, and ultimately this often comes down to encouraging the right kind of behaviours at work. And that's perhaps a good thought to finish on. Thank you very much for listening.